and welcome to my channel if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, but if it is not, welcome back. Today I am going to be talking about 5 oldie but a Goldie book recommendations. So the 5 books that I want to chat about today are not recent releases. The most recent book came out more than a decade ago, and the oldest book I'm going to talk about today came out 2 centuries ago. But these are some of my favorite books, and I just wanted to take an opportunity to talk about some of those old favorites, books that did not come out recently, however they have withstood the test of time and still hold up. So these are 5 oldies but goldies. And my cocktail pairing for today's video is another very simple one, and that is just a sangria. I had some fruit laying around in my kitchen that I wanted to use up. So there is apple, orange, and lime chopped up in here, and I added just a little bit of sugar too. And this feels like an appropriate toast as we near the end of summer. So cheers. Yeah, you can't go wrong. I did leave this in the fridge overnight for the flavors to all marry together and mingle. So this is tasting really, really fruity and delicious. But let's dive into the books. I'm going to start with the most recent book that I'd like to talk about. And I mentioned it very briefly in a previous video, and that is Among Others by Jo Walton. This book came out in 2012, I believe, for the first time. And it is a coming of age magical realism novel. I found this book to be incredibly whimsical, really imaginative, and I adored the way that Walton wove magical realism throughout this book. We do follow a young female protagonist. So there is the element of uncertainty of an unreliable narrator. We're not sure if this is part of our protagonist's imagination and that is how she's trying to cope, or if there really are fairies hidden throughout. I think this takes place in Wales. Yes. So there is that Welsh folklore woven throughout as well. The back here says that she was raised by a half-mad mother who dabbled in magic. Morwenna Phelps found refuge in 2 worlds. As a child growing up in Wales, she played among the spirits who made their homes in industrial ruins, but her mind found freedom in the science fiction novels that were her closest companions. I found this to just be a beautiful, beautiful novel. I've only read it, I believe, the once, maybe twice, so I think I'm due for a reread. But we follow Morwenna, or Maury, as she is sent to a boarding school in England, which is a place all but devoid of true magic. There, she tempts fate by doing magic herself in an attempt to find a circle of like-minded friends. But her magic attracts the attention of her broken and malign mother, pulling Morwenna toward a reckoning that will draw on everything she has learned in her years of engagement with stories and books. So this came out 12 years ago. I read it for the first time maybe 5 years ago, and it very quickly shot up to one of my favorite books ever. So if you're looking for a coming-of-age novel with magical realism woven throughout, I would highly recommend that you check out Among Others by Jo Walton. The next oldie but a Goldie book that I would like to talk about came out in 1989, and I think it is one that most people know about or have heard about, but that is The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. I read The Pillars of the Earth for the first time 6 years ago now, 7, around there, and I absolutely fell in love with this world. This is a very immersive historical fiction novel. We begin The Pillars of the Earth in, what year is it? 1100? 1300? Come on. Part 1 begins in 1135, and we are following the building of the Kingsbridge Cathedral. So this is a very grand, multiple POV book that then became a trilogy. I don't know if it was intended to be a trilogy, because The Pillars of the Earth does conclude, if I recall correctly, in a way that was satisfying. I then have gone on and read the second and third book in this trilogy. I have not read the prequel that Follett came out with a few years ago now, but he is really known for grand, immersive, historical fiction trilogies, really. There's another one of his that begins at the turn of the century, 1900, going into the First World War, that I've read, but I have only read the first 2 books about. I didn't find it quite as captivating. I didn't fall in love with the characters quite as much as I did with The Pillars of the Earth. So, The Pillars of the Earth tells the story of Philip, prior of Kingsbridge, a devout and resourceful monk driven to build the greatest Gothic cathedral the world has known. Of Tom, the mason who becomes his architect, a man divided in his soul. Of the beautiful, elusive Lady Alina, haunted by a secret shame. And of a struggle between good and evil that will turn church against state and brother against brother. It is a spellbinding tale of ambition, anarchy, and absolute power set against the sprawling medieval canvas of 12th century England. This is Ken Follett's historical masterpiece. And I will say, this is the first Follett that I have ever read, and it remains my favorite by him. Nothing has quite matched the grandness of Pillars of the Earth for me. So if you are looking for a really sprawling, grand epic with some romance, with betrayal, with heartbreak, and with love, I would definitely recommend that you check out The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett and see if it is for you. The next book that I'd like to talk about is jumping back in time considerably, and it is a classic by Austen, and that is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, which was published in 1818. So this is by far the oldest of my oldie but a Goldie books, and I would say that Northanger Abbey is my favorite Austen novel. So many people consider Northanger Abbey to be Austen's worst book, and I will say this is very, very different from her other works. Northanger Abbey is Austen's satirical take on Gothic tropes of the time. I personally adore Wuthering Heights. I think it's probably my favorite classical novel, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And that is the very Gothic romantic literature that is iconic of that time period. You have the atmospheric rolling moors, you have the pathetic fallacy with storms and thunder and very dramatic soliloquies. And this is Austen's take, poking fun of all of those tropes. Our main character, Catherine Morland, a reference right there to Wuthering Heights. Oh, it says here, right here on the back. Northanger Abbey is generally agreed to be Jane Austen's earliest major work, grew out of her distaste for the absurdities of the novels of her time, and in particular for the conventions of the Gothic novels with their impossibly perfect heroines and unnatural events. At Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen's charmingly imperfect heroine, Catherine Morland, meets all the trappings of Gothic horror and imagines the worst. Fortunately, she has at hand her own fundamental good sense and the irresistible but unsentimental hero, Henry Tilney. Disaster does eventually strike in the real world as distinct from the romantic one of her imagination, but without spoiling for too long the gay, good-humored atmosphere of this most delightful of books. Like I said, I adore Gothic horror, Gothic romance, Emily Bronte, and the books of that period, but I loved Austen's satirical take on them, and how she pointed out the absurdities of course it's not a ghost in that hallway of the castle. It's just someone rummaging through for a blanket or something like that. So if you have wanted to read a classic by Austen or not by Austen, and you have felt intimidated or just like the petty dramas and romances that are typical of some other novels of that time period, they're not your cup of tea, I would highly recommend picking up Northanger Abbey, flipping through, and seeing if maybe this one might capture your interest, because it is very different from Austen's other works, and I love it for how different it is. I adore Pride and Prejudice, but I think Northanger Abbey might be my favorite Austen. Maybe because partially it's such an underdog and people hate on it so much that I feel like I need to go to battle to defend Northanger Abbey, because it is an amazing classic. And if you don't get on very well with some of the other classics of this era, maybe a more tongue-in-cheek book will be your cup of tea. So my third oldie but a Goldie is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. That sucks. My penultimate oldie but a Goldie recommendation is another historical fiction. And while Pillars of the Earth does deal with a fair bit of politics, I would say, this fourth recommendation deals a whole lot more with political ambitions and strifes and struggles of power. And the book that I'm talking about is The Game of Kings by Dorothy Dunnett, which was published in 1961. If you are a fan of Game of Thrones, the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin, Martin has spoken in interviews about how The Game of Kings was a partial inspiration for his very famous series. So if you would perhaps like a complete series with that same vibe, that same power struggle, maybe check out the Lymond Chronicles by Dorothy Dunnett. This, however, is not a fantasy series. This is pure historical fiction that begins in 1547, and we follow a Scotsman, Francis Crawford of Lymond. The formidable outlaw and rebel is back in Edinburgh, and from his headlong arrival, he shows himself to be an unpredictable player in a Scotland of political violence and intrigue, which is also the heartland of his long estranged kinsfolk. His future depends on tracing 3 men, but there are others determined to stop him. I read this book for the first time back in high school. I was obsessed with all things Scotland in high school, and I still am, to be honest. I believe this was my first really big, epic, adult historical fiction in which there are very real consequences and people are out to murder one another in order to obtain and gain power. So I read this in high school, really enjoyed it, didn't read past the first book, and then I think about 6-7 years ago, my mom actually just picked this up for me as a surprise and gave it to me, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I read this book and I completely forgot that I had read it. So I reread The Game of Kings and have still not continued on with the series, but I do really want to, because I remember really getting on with this book, and I believe it took me a little bit to become invested with our main character. I didn't warm to him right away, but once I did, I was really compelled, really enthralled. There are 6 books in this series, so if you are looking for another sprawling epic taking place, this one it is set in Scotland in the 1500s. I would absolutely recommend The Game of Kings by Dorothy Dunnett. I don't hear anyone talking about this book, but it is one that I really have enjoyed the 2 times that I've read it, even though I've not continued on with the series. I need to do that. And yes, just a little fun fact for Game of Thrones fans, This is one of the series that inspired Martin. I believe he read it when he was growing up, and it was something that he carried with him and even just subconsciously had impacted the Game of Thrones, the Game of Kings. And finally, my last oldie but a Goldie book recommendation is likely no surprise if you have watched any of my previous videos or if we have chatted books in person. But this book was published in 1992 and it is A Song for Arbonne by Guy Gabriel Kay. This is the first Kay book that I ever read, I believe maybe 5 years ago. I picked it up at a local book sale on a whim because I found the cover to be quite compelling and just that classic 90s fantasy look and feel. I picked it up on a whim, didn't know much about Kay besides the fact that Brandon Sanderson had recommended him as an underrated author, and I knew that Kay was a Canadian author. So I picked this up, and I think it is hands down my favorite magical realism historical fiction book, and it is definitely within my top 5 favorite books of all time. I think I need to do a video just doing a review on this book because I love it so much. Now that I have spoken at such length about the tropes and the themes of A Song for Arbonne, let me summarize it very briefly for you by reading off of the back here, which says it began with love both courtly and forbidden, and with kingdoms endlessly opposed, one dominated by male rulers and their male god, the other in which women and their goddess held a share of earthly power. For the northern mercenary called Blaise, though, it began with the death of a king and a peace treaty that was a betrayal which sent him into a self-imposed exile. His wanderings would bring him to the kingdom of Arbonne, where the court of love made warriors bow to troubadours, and a well-sung ballad was valued as much as a skillfully swung sword. But Arbonne was a troubled realm, torn by an ancient feud between its most powerful dukes, and coveted as a prize by the land in which Blaise himself had grown to manhood. And no one, except perhaps Arbonne's goddess, could foresee that one northern mercenary might become the key to Arbonne's destiny. I adore this book, and I cannot sing its praises highly enough. I feel as if I'm overhyping it with how much I adore this book, but I think I read A Song for Arbonne just at the perfect time in my life to fall so deeply in love with it, and subsequently fall so deeply in love with Kay's writing. So if you are looking for a blend of genres, a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of magical realism, a little bit of historical fiction, if you're looking for that, it's not quite a quest, but Blaise is on a journey of discovery. There are political weavings happening around him that he does not want to be a part of, but he keeps being pulled in and becoming a big part of the story and of that power struggle. If any of that sounds intriguing or compelling to you, please check out A Song for Arbonne. Pick it up, flip through it, and let me know what you think, because this is my best oldie but a Goldie book recommendation. So these are the 5 books that I would like to recommend to you today. These are my oldies but goldies. Books that weren't published recently but have withstood the test of time, for me at least, and have remained within the ranking of some of the best books I've ever read. Please let me know down below what some of your oldies but goldies are, because I'd love to get more book recommendations. But for now, that is it for me. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will be back soon with a new one. Bye for now.